Imagine a man so powerful. He offered to pay his country's entire national debt. A staggering 10 billion just for a promise that he would never be extradited to the United States. This wasn't a billionaire philanthropist or a world leader. This was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, a man who built his empire not on oil or technology, but on the white powder of cocaine. A man who declared war on his own government and, for a terrifyingly long time, was winning. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a force of nature, a king who ruled with a combination of boundless generosity and bottomless brutality. A man who built entire neighborhoods for the poor while simultaneously ordering the murders of thousands, including judges, journalists, and policemen, anyone who stood in his path. His story is a Shakespearean tragedy written in blood, cocaine, and money. A chilling lesson on how far ambition can go when it is completely unmoored from morality. So, settle in, relax, and let us journey back to a time when one man held a nation hostage as we delve into the unbelievable, true story of Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine. If you are fascinated by the intricate stories of history's most powerful figures, remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a deep dive into the past. The origins of a monster are often found not in a dramatic explosion of evil, but in the quiet, simmering cauldron of ambition, poverty, and a perceived lack of options. To understand Pablo Escobar, one must first travel back to the Medellín of the 1950s and 60s, a city nestled in the Aburra Valley, beautiful yet brutally divided by class. Born on December 1st, 1949, Pablo was the son of a humble farmer, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar, and a schoolteacher, Hermelda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio. He was one of 7 children, and the family lived in a modest, unassuming house in the suburb of Rio Negro, just outside Medellín. From a very young age, the stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots was seared into his consciousness. He would look up at the luxurious homes of the elite perched on the hillsides and feel not admiration, but a deep, gnawing resentment. This resentment was the kindling for the inferno that would later consume a nation. His mother, Hermelda, was a formidable influence, instilling in him a fierce ambition and the belief that he was destined for greatness, a narrative he would cling to throughout his life. She famously kept a scrapbook of his achievements, a chillingly normal maternal gesture that would later be filled with newspaper clippings of his escalating atrocities. As a boy, Pablo was intelligent and driven, but he was also possessed of a terrifying ruthlessness that surfaced early. The stories from his childhood, perhaps embellished by legend, nonetheless paint a telling picture. He is said to have sold fake lottery tickets to his classmates, not for the meager money, but for the thrill of the deception and the power it gave him. He allegedly stole tombstones from a local cemetery, sanded off the inscriptions, and resold them to grieving families. An act of such profound cynicism that it hints at a complete detachment from the emotional world of others. This was not petty delinquency. It was a masterclass in exploiting despair for profit, a dark precursor of his future business model. He attended the University of Antioquia briefly, not as a formal student, but as an auditor, and it was here, on the fringes of academia, that he was first exposed to the radical political ideologies of the time, particularly the writings of Che Guevara and Marxist thought. He absorbed not the ideology of equality, but the tactics of revolutionary warfare and the concept of the state as an enemy to be overthrown. More importantly, the university campus was a hub for the burgeoning black market economy, and it was here that Escobar found his true calling. He began his criminal career not with cocaine, but with a series of small-time hustles, selling stolen cigarettes, counterfeit diplomas, and fake car insurance policies. He quickly graduated to stealing cars, a more lucrative but also more dangerous enterprise. His ambition, however, was a furnace that demanded more fuel. The turning point came when he discovered the potential of contraband. He started by smuggling imported electronics, whiskey, and perfume, building a network of contacts and corrupt officials that would become the skeleton of his future empire. He learned the intricate geography of the Colombian coastline, the hidden coves and landing strips, and, most crucially, he mastered the art of bribery, understanding that every official, every policeman, every customs agent had a price. This period was his real education. He learned that in a country where the legal economy offered little to those from his background, the illegal economy was the true land of opportunity. It was during this time that he allegedly made his first major score, stealing a load of expensive stereo equipment. The legend goes that he was so proud of this haul that he posed for a photograph, sitting atop the boxes of stolen goods, a wide, confident grin on his face. It was the smile of a young man who had discovered a fundamental truth about his world. The rules did not apply to him if he was bold enough to break them. This was the foundation, the gritty, unglamorous apprenticeship of the man who would become the king of cocaine. He was building not just capital, but a philosophy, a belief that power, not morality, was the ultimate currency, and that any door could be opened with a combination of calculated violence and strategic generosity. The stage was set, the actor was ready, and the product that would catapult him from a successful smuggler to a global phenomenon was just waiting to be discovered. The transition from a successful contraband smuggler to the architect of a global cocaine empire was not an instantaneous leap, but a calculated, strategic evolution driven by Escobar's voracious appetite for wealth and power. The catalyst for this transformation was a shift in the American cultural landscape during the 1970s. The hedonistic disco era, with its rampant drug use, created an insatiable demand for a high-quality, luxurious stimulant. Cocaine, once the preserve of the elite, was becoming the drug of choice for the middle classes, and the United States represented a market of unimaginable scale and profitability. Pablo Escobar, with his well-established smuggling routes and networks, was perfectly positioned to exploit this burgeoning demand. His first foray into the drug trade was modest, acting as a middleman, protecting and transporting paste and base for other, more established traffickers. But Escobar was never content to work for others for long. He quickly recognized that the real power lay not in the logistics, but in control of the entire supply chain. From the coca fields of Peru and Bolivia to the nostrils of the consumers in Miami and Los Angeles, his genius, if it can be called that, was in his industrial vision. He did not just see cocaine as a commodity. He saw it as an industry that needed vertical integration. He began by establishing direct relationships with coca growers, ensuring a steady and reliable supply of the raw material. Then, with a team of chemists often trained in the United States or Europe, he set up sophisticated processing laboratories hidden deep in the jungles of Colombia. These were not makeshift jungle labs. They were sophisticated chemical factories capable of producing tons of pure, high-quality cocaine. The final and most critical piece of the puzzle was transportation. This is where Escobar's logistical brilliance truly shone. He pioneered methods that were both audacious and incredibly effective. He purchased a small fleet of private airplanes, often buying them legitimately through front companies in the United States. These planes would fly the cocaine north, using deserted airstrips in the Bahamas or remote corners of the Florida Everglades for refueling and transfer. He also used go-fast boats, stuffing them with waterproofed bales of cocaine and making high-speed runs across the Caribbean. But his most infamous innovation was the use of mules. He would recruit ordinary-looking people, sometimes even pregnant women or elderly couples, paying them to carry suitcases lined with cocaine onto commercial flights. This network was so vast and so efficient that at the height of his power, it was estimated that his cartel was supplying up to 80% of the cocaine consumed in the United States, smuggling in multiple tons of the drug every single week. The profits were beyond comprehension, a tidal wave of cash that threatened to drown his entire operation. He famously had to spend $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to bundle the stacks of cash. He would bury millions of dollars in plastic, wrapped bundles in underground hideouts all across Colombia, hidden in fields, under floors, and in the walls of his properties. He purchased fleets of cars, mansions, and entire islands. Yet, this unprecedented influx of wealth also presented a new problem: how to launder it and integrate it into the legitimate economy. This led to the next phase of his empire building, the creation of a vast web of legitimate businesses. He bought hundreds of properties, including the sprawling Hacienda Nampoles, a 7.7 square mile estate complete with a private zoo, lakes, and a fleet of antique cars. He invested in construction companies, radio stations, and countless other enterprises, all designed to clean his dirty money and project an image of a respectable, self-made businessman. This was a crucial part of his persona, the duality that would define his public image. To the outside world, he was Don Pablo, the generous benefactor, the man who built houses, soccer fields, and churches for the poor. But within his organization, he was El Patron, the boss, a man who ruled with absolute authority and terrifying violence. This period of meteoric rise was not just about accumulating wealth. It was about building a parallel state, one with its own economy, its own army, and its own code of ethics, which was no code at all. He was creating a kingdom where his word was law, and the only sin was disloyalty. The sheer, unimaginable scale of his wealth demanded not just business acumen, but a new form of power, political and social power. Escobar understood, with the instinct of a master propagandist, that to secure his empire, he needed to be more than a feared criminal. He needed to be loved, or at least desperately needed, by a significant portion of the population. This led to one of the most bizarre and effective chapters of his life, his brief but impactful foray into legitimate politics. In the early 1980s, flush with cash and a burning desire for legitimacy and, crucially, immunity from extradition, Escobar leveraged his growing reputation as a folk hero among the poor to launch a political career. He had already been building this foundation for years through his strategy known as plata o plomo, silver or lead. For those who cooperated, there was money, more than they could ever earn legally. For those who resisted, there was only death. But for the masses, the disenfranchised and forgotten citizens of Medellin's slums, he offered something else entirely hope. He built entire neighborhoods of brick houses, replacing the shanties of the poor with proper homes in projects he named Barrio Pablo Escobar. He constructed soccer fields, funded community centers, and handed out cash freely, earning him the enduring nickname Robin Hood. It was a brilliant, cynical, and devastatingly effective public relations campaign. Bolstered by this grassroots adulation, he managed to get himself elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Congress in 1982. For a brief, surreal moment, Pablo Escobar, the drug lord, had a legitimate seat in the halls of power. He walked the corridors of the Capitolio Nacional in Bogotá, shaking hands with the very politicians he would later try to assassinate. He saw this not as a duty, but as a shield. His primary goal was to gain legal protection and, most importantly, to block the growing movement in Colombia to extradite narco-traffickers to the United States, a prospect he feared more than anything else. He famously declared, "I prefer a grave in Colombia to a jail cell in the United States." However, this political charade was short-lived. His newfound visibility attracted the scrutiny of a courageous and dogged individual, Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. Lara Bonilla, refusing to be cowed, began to publicly denounce Escobar in the media and in government sessions, exposing his criminal background and ensuring his expulsion from Congress in early 1984. The expulsion was a humiliating blow to Escobar's carefully crafted image of a respectable businessman and philanthropist. It stripped away the thin veneer of legitimacy he had worked so hard to acquire and revealed the brutal kingpin beneath. In response, Escobar did what he always did when confronted with an immovable obstacle. He ordered it destroyed. On April 30, 1984, as Justice Minister Lara Bonilla was being driven home in his Mercedes-Benz, a hail of bullets from assassins on motorcycles cut him down, turning his car into a sieve and killing him instantly. The assassination of a sitting justice minister was an unprecedented act of war against the Colombian state. It was a line that even the most corrupt officials had never dared to cross. The government of President Belisario Betancur, which had been hesitant and divided on how to handle the traffickers, was forced into action. It immediately reinstated the extradition treaty with the United States, signing the first of many warrants for Escobar's capture and extradition. The murder of Lara, Bonilla marked a definitive turning point. The period of uneasy coexistence was over. The mask was off. The war had truly begun. Escobar was no longer a smuggler playing politician. He was now a narcoterrorist at war with the establishment. A man who had declared that he would rather bring the entire country to its knees than surrender to its laws. This act set in motion a cycle of violence that would drown Colombia in blood for nearly a decade, pitting the combined might of the state, the police, the military, and eventually a vigilante group funded by his rivals, against the seemingly limitless resources and bottomless ruthlessness of a single man and the empire he had built from the ground up. The death of Lara Bonilla was not just a murder. It was a declaration, a point of no return from which there would be no retreat and no forgiveness. The assassination of Rodrigo, Lara Bonilla plunged Colombia into an abyss from which it would not emerge for a decade. The state had been challenged directly, and its response was to reinstate the ultimate weapons, extradition. For Escobar, this was the nightmare scenario. He feared the U.S. justice system, not for its harsh prisons, but for its incorruptibility. In Colombia, he could bribe, threaten, or kill his way to freedom. In America, his money and his hitmen would be useless. His empire, his family, his very identity were all under existential threat. His response was to unleash a campaign of terror so brutal, so comprehensive, that it would become known simply as the Violent Peace, or the Bombing Campaign, a period where the very fabric of Colombian society was torn apart by fire and shrapnel. Escobar's strategy was psychological warfare on a national scale. He aimed not just to kill his enemies, but to paralyze the entire nation with fear, to make the cost of enforcing the law so high that the government would have no choice but to negotiate with him and revoke the extradition treaty. The primary instrument of this terror was the Medellín Cartel's dedicated assassination wing, a group of ruthless young killers known as sicarios. These were not ordinary gangsters. They were often teenagers from the slums, recruited young, desensitized to violence, and fanatically loyal to Escobar, whom they saw as their benefactor. They were trained in urban warfare, equipped with motorcycles, sophisticated communication radios, and an arsenal of weapons that often rivaled the police, including Uzi submachine guns, AK-47s, and grenades. They operated with chilling efficiency, carrying out drive-by shootings in broad daylight, often for as little as 500s a murder. But the violence soon escalated far beyond targeted assassinations. When the government refused to back down, Escobar turned to a new, more indiscriminate tool, the car bomb. The goal was mass casualty, maximum media impact, and the creation of an atmosphere of pervasive, random dread. The first major bomb detonated outside the headquarters of El Espectador, a newspaper whose publisher, Guillermo Cano, had been a vocal critic of the cartel. Cano had already been assassinated in 1986, and the bombing was a message to anyone who dared to follow in his footsteps. But the most shocking act of this war, the one that truly branded Escobar as an enemy of humanity in the eyes of the world, was the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 on November 27, 1989. The cartel had planted a bomb on the Boeing 727, intending to assassinate a single presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who was scheduled to be on board. Gaviria had fortuitously changed his plans at the last moment, but the bomb detonated as planned, tearing the plane apart in mid-air and scattering wreckage and the bodies of all 107 people on board across the countryside. The attack was a failure in its specific objective, but a horrifying success in its broader aim. It demonstrated that no one was safe, that even the simple act of boarding a commercial flight could be a death sentence. The cartel's war was not only against the state, but also against a rival organization, the Cali cartel, leading to a bloody turf war that claimed thousands of lives. And then, in an act of breathtaking audacity that shocked the nation's conscience, Escobar's sicarios gunned down the one figure who represented hope and integrity to millions of Colombians, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán. Galán was a charismatic reformer, a man poised to win the presidency on an uncompromising anti-narcotics platform. His murder on August 18, 1989, ordered directly by Escobar, was the catalyst for an unprecedented government crackdown. President Virgilio Barco, invoking emergency powers, launched an all-out offensive, authorizing the seizure of cartel properties and the mass incarceration of their associates. The hunt for Pablo Escobar was now the Colombian government's top priority. The entire country became a battlefield, with police checkpoints on every major road, raids happening daily, and a sense of civil war hanging in the air. Escobar, in response, only intensified his campaign, bombing police stations, shopping centers, and the headquarters of the Departamento Administrativo de Seguridad, DAS, the Colombian equivalent of the FBI. This was the horrifying logic of Escobar's war. He believed he could bomb the Colombian state into submission, into granting him the one thing he wanted above all else, a promise that he would never be sent to the United States. He was willing to drown his homeland in blood to secure his own personal amnesty. The relentless, nationwide terror campaign, while demonstrating Escobar's immense power, also sowed the seeds of his eventual downfall. The Colombian state, though wounded and reeling, was not defeated. The assassination of Luis Carlos Galán had galvanized a new level of political will, and the indiscriminate bombings turned public sentiment sharply against the capo. The wealthy elite in Bogotá, who had once perhaps viewed the drug war as a problem for the police, were now seeing their own clubs and shopping centers targeted. More importantly, a new and formidable enemy was emerging from an unexpected quarter, his own rivals. The Cali cartel, led by the shrewd and less flamboyant Rodriguez Orjuela brothers and Gilberto Rodriguez, had long been engaged in a bloody battle with Medellín for control of the cocaine trade. But they understood that Escobar's war on the state was bad for business, bringing an intolerable level of heat and scrutiny onto all their operations. In a secret and unprecedented pact, the Cali cartel decided to ally themselves with the very government Escobar was fighting. They provided intelligence, resources, and funding to help the state hunt down their common enemy. This alliance marked a critical shift in the balance of power. However, the most devastating blow to Escobar's empire would come from a group even closer to home. For years, Escobar had ruled Medellín through a combination of fear and patronage. But his violent crusade against extradition was causing immense collateral damage, tearing apart the very city he claimed to champion. A group of prominent Medellín businessmen, politicians, and ranchers who had been victims of his kidnappings and extortion demands, a practice Escobar used to fund his war, had reached their breaking point. They were being bled dry by El Patron, forced to pay a war tax to finance the very terror that was destroying their lives. They could not go to the police, as Escobar had infiltrated or neutralized them. They could not rely on the army, which was stretched thin. So, they took a desperate and fateful step. They decided to fund their own private army to fight fire with fire. This group would become known as Los Papes, an acronym for Los Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, or Those Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Los Peeps was a vigilante death squad composed of a toxic mix of former Escobar associates, rival drug traffickers from the Cali cartel, and a paramilitary group led by the Castillo brothers, Fidel and Carlos, whose father had been killed by Escobar's men. Their campaign of vengeance was swift, brutal, and merciless. They did not seek arrests or due process. Their goal was the systematic and utter annihilation of Pablo Escobar's entire world. They began by targeting his economic infrastructure, bombing his mansions, his family's properties, and his beloved Hacienda No Poles, which was left a charred ruin. Then, they began hunting down and executing his lawyers, his accountants, his hitmen, and anyone remotely connected to his organization. The streets of Medellín became a killing ground, with bodies of Escobar's associates turning up daily, often with signs pinned to them bearing the ominous Los Peeps acronym. This was a new kind of war, one fought in the shadows with a ruthlessness that even Escobar found shocking. He was no longer just fighting a distant government in Bogota. He was fighting a mirror image of his own brutality, fueled by intimate hatred and a personal thirst for revenge. The psychological impact on Escobar was profound. Los Pips were dismantling his support network, killing the people he relied on, and destroying the symbols of his wealth and power. They were proving that his own tactics of terror could be used against him with devastating effect. Crucially, and most controversially, the newly formed Bloque de Bituescueda, the elite police task force dedicated solely to hunting Escobar, began to operate in a gray area of collaboration with Los Peeps. While the government officially denied any connection, it was an open secret that intelligence was being shared. The Bloque de Bituescueda, armed with top-tier American technology and training from the U.S., Drug Enforcement Administration DEA, and Central Intelligence Agency CIA, provided the technical expertise and official sanction. Los Peeps provided the ground intelligence, the ruthlessness, and the deep, personal knowledge of Escobar's inner circle that the police lacked. This powerful, if unholy, alliance created a pincer movement that began to tighten around the increasingly isolated drug lord. Escobar, who had always moved with impunity through Medellín, was now being squeezed from all sides. His empire was crumbling, his allies were being exterminated, and his once impenetrable cloak of invincibility was being torn to shreds. The hunter had become the hunted, and the walls of his own creation were closing in. The combined, relentless pressure from the state and the vengeful vigilantes of Los Pipis created an environment where Escobar's world shrank from a nation to a single city, and then to a few neighborhoods within that city. He was now a fugitive in his own kingdom, a ghost haunting the streets he once ruled. This period marked his final, desperate metamorphosis from a flamboyant billionaire into a paranoid, hunted animal. To evade capture, he employed a dizzying array of safe houses, often ordinary-looking middle-class apartments, which he would never occupy for more than a few nights. His security protocol was obsessive and elaborate. He never slept in the same bed twice in a row. He used complex codes and surveillance routes for all movements. He had a network of lookouts, known as bell ringers, who would monitor police and military movements and ring bells or set off fireworks to warn of approaching danger. He relied on a small, fiercely loyal inner circle, including his personal bodyguard, Mario El Chapo Castallo, and his trusted radio operator, known as Limon. Yet, even within this circle, the paranoia was corrosive. The success of Los Pips was proof that his organization had been fatally compromised. That betrayal could come from anyone. His greatest fear was no longer just extradition, but being killed by his enemies, denied the chance to negotiate his own surrender on his own terms. It was this fear, combined with the devastating attrition of his organization, that led him to pursue a seemingly paradoxical strategy surrender. But for Pablo Escobar, surrender was not an admission of defeat. It was a tactical maneuver, a way to regain control. He began a complex and protracted negotiation with the government of the new president, Cesar Gaviria, who had taken office in the wake of Gaon's assassination. Gaviria, seeking an end to the carnage that was crippling the country, was open to a deal. Escobar's demands were specific and non-negotiable. He would turn himself in only if the government guaranteed he would not be extradited, and only if he could design and build his own prison. It was an audacious proposal, the equivalent of a general demanding to build his own prisoner of war camp. Astonishingly, the government agreed. A constitutional assembly was convened, which ultimately produced a new constitution in 1991 that, among other things, prohibited the extradition of Colombian nationals. With his primary objective achieved, Escobar moved forward with his surrender. But he did not simply walk into a police station. He orchestrated it as a final media spectacle, a performance of power, even in apparent submission. The prison was built to his specifications on a hill overlooking his hometown of Envigado, a municipality on the outskirts of Medellín. It was named La Catedral, the cathedral, and it was less a prison and more a fortified luxury resort. It featured a giant dollhouse for his daughter, a fully stocked bar, a discotheque, a jacuzzi, a soccer field, and sophisticated communication equipment. On June 19, 1991, after a bizarre and public manhunt that was in reality a carefully choreographed farce, Escobar surrendered to authorities and was escorted to La Catedral. For a time, he seemed to have won. He held court from behind the walls of his custom-built kingdom, conducting business, entertaining visitors, and living in luxury while the state footed the bill for his guards. He had managed to escape the war, secure his safety from extradition, and maintain a shocking degree of control over his remaining empire. He had outmaneuvered the system once again, turning a prison sentence into a strategic retreat. But the inherent instability of a man like Escobar, a man who could not abide by any rules, even his own, meant that this arrangement was doomed from the start. The calm of La Catedral was illusory, the eye of the hurricane. His inherent violence and his inability to relinquish power would soon shatter this fragile peace and set the stage for the final, bloody act of his life. The king in his gilded cage was about to rattle the bars, and the consequences would be fatal. The carefully negotiated peace of La Catedral began to unravel with the same force that had characterized Escobar's entire life, a volatile mixture of paranoia, pride, and unchecked brutality. Within the walls of his private prison, he was not a reformed prisoner, but a CEO running his empire from a secure, state-sanctioned headquarters. He continued to direct his remaining operations, settling scores and managing his finances, all under the passive gaze of the guards who were, in effect, his employees. The illusion of a penitent man serving his time was a fiction that no one, least of all the Colombian public, believed. The tipping point came from an incident that exposed the utter farce of his incarceration and forced the government's hand. In July 1992, Escobar's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He became convinced that two of his former cartel associates, Fernando Galeano and Mario Castallo, were not only conspiring against him, but had also stolen $20 million from him. In a brutal display of his unchallenged authority, Escobar summoned the two men to La Catedral under false pretenses. Once inside, they were subjected to a horrific and prolonged torture session. They were beaten, interrogated, and ultimately executed on Escobar's orders, their bodies dismembered with chainsaws and buried within the prison grounds. This act of savage violence, committed inside a state facility, was a scandal that the Gaviria government could not ignore. It was one thing for Escobar to live in luxury. It was another for him to turn a government prison into his personal torture chamber and execution site. The event was a direct and humiliating challenge to the state's authority. The government, facing a massive public outcry and international condemnation, decided it had to act. It began plans to transfer Escobar to a real, conventional, high-security prison, a move that would strip him of his control, his comforts, and, he feared, his safety. For Escobar, this was the ultimate betrayal of their agreement. He knew that, in a standard prison, he would be vulnerable not only to the state, but more terrifyingly, to his enemies from Los Pips and the Cali cartel, who would surely find a way to reach him. The prospect of being moved was a death sentence in his mind. On July 26, 1992, as government officials and a team of military commandos approached La Catedral to formally serve the transfer order, they found the prison suspiciously quiet. The guards, loyal to Escobar, had offered no resistance. After a tense search, they discovered the truth. Pablo Escobar, the most wanted man in the world, had simply walked out. He and his 9 closest henchmen had exploited a gap in the security perimeter, a perimeter he had designed himself, and vanished back into the sprawling urban jungle of Medellin. His escape was a masterstroke of humiliation against the state, proving that even when he was in their custody, he was always in control. But this time, the world outside had changed dramatically. The escape marked the beginning of the end. He was now a fugitive with a drastically diminished power base. Los Pips had decimated his financial and operational structure, killing over 300 of his associates, including his most skilled lawyers and accountants. The Cali cartel was rapidly absorbing his markets. The Bloque de Bidusquita, now more determined and better equipped than ever, was given a single, unequivocal mission: find and kill Pablo Escobar. The government had learned its lesson. Negotiation was no longer an option. The only acceptable outcomes were his death in a confrontation or his capture, with the immediate goal of extradition. Escobar was now truly alone, a wounded king running through the ruins of his fallen kingdom, with every former ally a potential traitor and every shadow a possible assassin. The final, frantic chase had begun, and it would be a race against time, fought with a new, terrifying weapon that would ultimately seal his fate: the relentless, technologically advanced, and utterly ruthless pursuit by a state that had finally decided to fight fire with inferno. The final 16 months of Pablo Escobar's life were a desperate, paranoid, and rapidly shrinking odyssey through the very slums that had once been his fortress. His escape from La Catedral was not a triumphant return to power, but the beginning of a frantic and ultimately futile scramble for survival. The world had closed in on him with a vengeance. The Medellín Cartel was in ruins, its leadership decimated by Los Pips, its infrastructure shattered, and its markets cannibalized by the more pragmatic and less flamboyant Cali cartel. The Bloque de Bidusquita, under the command of General Hugo Martinez, had been transformed into a relentless, single-minded hunting machine, operating with unprecedented resources and a blanket authorization to use whatever force was necessary. They had established a massive headquarters in Medellin, dubbed the Fort, and flooded the city with thousands of troops. But the most significant change, the one that would prove to be Escobar's ultimate undoing, was technological. With extensive support from the United States, the hunters now had access to tools that could negate Escobar's mastery of the urban landscape. The Americans provided the Bloque with sophisticated direction, finding equipment capable of triangulating the signals from radio communications. Escobar's lifeline, his only means of directing what was left of his organization and staying in contact with his family, was his radio. He was a known communications addict, a man who needed to be constantly on the air, giving orders, seeking information, and soothing his own paranoia. This habit, which had once been his strength, now became his most critical vulnerability. The Blokey's strategy was simple yet brutal. They would find him through his voice. They deployed listening posts across the city, painstakingly mapping the signals that emanated from the labyrinthine neighborhoods of Medellín. Every transmission brought them a step closer. Escobar, aware of this threat, constantly changed frequencies and locations, using a network of safe houses, but the net was inexorably tightening. His existence during this period was one of profound isolation and fear. He moved between cramped, modest apartments, often in the middle-class neighborhood of Los Olivos, a far cry from the opulent mansions of his past. He was accompanied only by a single bodyguard, his driver and radio operator, a young man known as Lemon. His world had shrunk to a few city blocks. He could no longer trust anyone. The culture of plata o plomo had reversed itself, and the reward for his capture or death, coupled with the terror of Los Peeps, made every face a potential threat. He was a ghost, haunted by the very specter of betrayal he had so often wielded against others. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. His family, his wife Maria Victoria, his son Juan Pablo, and his daughter Manuela had become pawns in this endgame. Fearing for their lives from Los Pips, they had sought refuge in Germany, but were deported back to Colombia, eventually checking into the hotel Tiquendama in Bogota under government protection. Escobar's phone calls with his son, Juan Pablo, were filled with a desperate, almost pathetic, longing and a fading hope for a negotiated surrender that the government was no longer willing to even consider. He knew the end was near. The hunters were closing in, and their most effective weapon was not a gun, but a secret intelligence pipeline that flowed directly from the heart of his crumbling empire. The bloke de Bitusqueda had managed to turn key figures within Escobar's inner circle. The most crucial of these was his own cousin and longtime confidant, Luis Fernando, El Negro, Galeano. Another was his trusted money launderer, Roberto El Osito Escobar, though the exact identities remain a subject of debate. These individuals, motivated by a combination of self-preservation, the lure of reward money, and perhaps a desire to end the bloodshed, began providing real-time information on Escobar's movements and, most importantly, his communications. They confirmed the radio frequencies he was using and the general area where he was hiding. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on December 2, 1993. A desperate phone call from Escobar to his son was intercepted and traced. The bloke's direction, finding equipment, pinpointed the signal to a specific house. Carrera 79B245D94 in the Los Olivos neighborhood. The order was given. The final raid was underway. The king was cornered in a nondescript 2-story house, his back against the wall, with only his radio and his bodyguard left. The world was about to witness the violent, inglorious end of the man who had once held a nation in the palm of his hand. The final, violent culmination of the manhunt began with a quiet, focused intensity on the afternoon of December 2, 1993. The Bloke D B2 Squida, having triangulated the signal from Escobar's radio to the specific address in Los Olivos, moved with a swift and practiced precision born of years of frustration and failure. This was not a chaotic raid. It was a military operation, meticulously planned and executed. A team of 17 elite soldiers, led by the experienced Captain Hugo Aguilar, descended upon the neighborhood, cordoning off the area and taking up strategic positions around the modest, two-story tan brick house. The atmosphere was thick with a tense anticipation. Every man involved knew the monumental significance of their target and the extreme danger he still represented. Inside the house, Pablo Escobar and his bodyguard, Pálvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as Limon, were completely unaware of the trap that had just been sprung around them. Escobar was on the second floor, likely in the midst of one of his characteristic long, rambling conversations on his Motorola radio, a device that had been his command center and his Achilles heel. The sequence of events that followed has been pieced together from the official accounts of the raiding team, though it remains shrouded in the inevitable fog of war and the competing narratives that such a historic event generates. The soldiers, after confirming there was no easy entry point without a direct confrontation, initiated the raid. They did not knock. They did not call out a warning. They burst into the house, their weapons raised, their senses heightened to a razor's edge. The sound of the door being forced open or a window being breached would have been the first and only warning Escobar and Limon received. What happened next was a frantic, close quarters struggle for survival that lasted mere minutes, but would echo for decades. As the soldiers stormed up the narrow staircase to the second floor, they were met with gunfire. Lim, in a final act of loyalty, engaged the advancing troops, providing a desperate, fleeting distraction for his boss. In the ensuing exchange of bullets, Limon was shot and killed, his body falling on the staircase. This momentary delay was all Escobar had. He scrambled, not for a weapon to make a final stand, but for an escape route. His entire life had been a series of brilliant, audacious escapes, and even in this, his final moment, his instinct was to run. He bolted across the tiled floor of the second floor landing, heading towards the roof. The roof represented freedom. The chaotic labyrinth of Medellin's rooftops where he could potentially vanish once more. He was almost there, but the soldiers were faster. As he ran, a volley of bullets tore into his body. He was hit multiple times, the impacts throwing him forward. He stumbled and fell, collapsing onto the sun-baked concrete roof of the house he had chosen as his final refuge. The initial government report, one that would be fiercely contested and debated for years to come, stated that Escobar was killed in a shootout, that he had fired at the officers and they had returned fire, killing him. However, the forensic evidence and the accounts of those present painted a more complex picture. The fatal shots, it was determined, were not from the front, but from behind, and one, crucially, entered through his ear. This specific trajectory gave rise to the persistent and widely believed theory that Pablo Escobar did not die in a prolonged gunfight, but was executed at point blank range, either after being wounded or while trying to surrender. The most compelling narrative suggests that as he lay wounded on the roof, a specific soldier approached and delivered the coup de grace, the final point blank shot to the head that ended his life instantly. The man who had orchestrated the deaths of thousands, who had bombed airliners and government buildings, who had held a nation hostage for a decade, was now just a body on a rooftop, dressed in a simple blue tracksuit and cheap sneakers. The news of his death spread through Medellín and the world with the force of a seismic shock. The soldiers, realizing the magnitude of their success, secured the scene. They found his radio still active and a small, pitiful stash of cash, a mere $2,000, a stark and poignant contrast to the billions he had once commanded. They took photographs of the corpse, images that would soon be splashed across every newspaper and television screen on the planet, providing a gruesome and undeniable confirmation. The reign of Pablo Escobar was over. The king of cocaine had finally fallen, not in a palace, but on a dusty rooftop in a middle-class neighborhood, betrayed by his own voice and the relentless, technologically aided pursuit of his enemies. The immediate aftermath of Pablo Escobar's death was a surreal and volatile mix of national catharsis, public spectacle, and simmering tension. As the news radiated out from the rooftop in Los Olivos, the city of Medellín seemed to hold its breath, unsure of how to process the sudden, violent vacuum left by its fallen king. The soldiers of the Bloque de Bituascueda, understanding the symbolic power of their prize, transported Escobar's body to the Medellín headquarters of the DEAS, the very institution he had bombed and terrorized for years. There, in a cold, sterile room, the corpse was laid out on a metal gurney for official identification and a makeshift, macabre press conference. The images captured in that room are etched into the collective memory of a generation. The lifeless body, the matted hair, the blood-stained tracksuit, and the unmistakable, waxy pallor of death. Journalists and officials jostled for a view, cameras flashing, creating a grotesque gallery of proof for a world that could scarcely believe the news. But it was the subsequent journey of his body that revealed the profoundly complicated and fractured legacy he left behind. From the DAS building, the coffin was taken to a funeral home in the Atagui district. And it was here that the true, schizophrenic nature of his public image manifested in a raw and emotional display. As the hearse carrying his body moved through the streets, it was not met with universal condemnation or quiet relief, but with an outpouring of grief from the thousands of poor and disenfranchised citizens who had been the beneficiaries of his brutal generosity. They poured out of the slums, the very barrios he had built, weeping, wailing, and chanting his name. To them, he was not the narcoterrorist of the headlines. He was Don Pablo, the Robin Hood figure who had built their homes, paved their streets, and given them a sense of agency in a society that had otherwise ignored them. They saw in his death the end of an era of patronage, the silencing of a powerful, albeit monstrous, voice that had spoken for them. This public mourning was a stark and unsettling counterpoint to the official narrative of a criminal mastermind brought to justice. It was a visceral reminder that Escobar's power was rooted not only in fear, but in a perverse form of populism, in his ability to address the very real failures of the Colombian state. Meanwhile, for the political and economic elite in Bogota, and for the governments of the United States and other nations, his death was an unequivocal victory, the closing of a dark and bloody chapter. It was a validation of their relentless pursuit and a signal that the state could, ultimately, reassert its monopoly on violence. For the rival Cali cartel, it was a business opportunity, a chance to absorb the remnants of the Medellín Cartel's network and dominate the global cocaine trade unchallenged, which they would do for a brief period before their own eventual downfall. And for the members of Los Pips and the Castallo brothers, it was a moment of triumphant vengeance, the successful conclusion of their bloody crusade. The funeral itself was a tense, heavily guarded affair, restricted to his immediate family. His mother Hermilda, his wife Maria Victoria, his son Juan Pablo, and his daughter Manuela. He was buried in the Monte Sacro cemetery under a simple gray slab, a deliberate attempt at anonymity to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine or a target for desecration. The death of Pablo Escobar did not, as many had hoped, mark the end of the drug war or the violence it spawned. In many ways, it simply fragmented it. The centralized, charismatic leadership of the Medellín Cartel was replaced by a more decentralized, less personal, but equally violent network of smaller cartels and paramilitary groups. The cocaine trade continued unabated, adapting and evolving, proving that the problem was far greater than any single individual, no matter how powerful. The story of Pablo Escobar is not just a biography of a criminal. It is a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of absolute power, the fragility of state institutions in the face of overwhelming corruption, and the dangerous allure of the outlaw who positions himself as the savior of the forgotten. His death brought a sense of closure, but it did not bring peace. It ended the life of a man, but it could not kill the legend, the myth, or the deep-seated social and economic conditions that had allowed him to flourish in the first place. The physical death of Pablo Escobar on that Medellín rooftop did not, and could not, extinguish the vast and complex legacy he imprinted upon Colombia and the world. His story did not conclude with his burial. Instead, it fragmented and evolved, seeping into the very cultural, political, and criminal DNA of the nation, creating a posthumous narrative as contested and potent as his life had been. The immediate consequence was a geopolitical shift in the global drug trade. With the Medellín Cartel decapitated, the more discreet and businesslike Cali Cartel swiftly ascended to become the world's dominant cocaine syndicate. For a few years, they operated with a chilling efficiency, leveraging their political connections and avoiding the headline, grabbing terror tactics that had ultimately doomed their rival. However, their reign was short-lived. A massive crackdown by Colombian and American authorities in the mid-1990s led to the capture or surrender of its top leaders. demonstrating that while the players had changed, the fundamental war continued. The dismantling of Kali did not bring an end to the trade either. It simply gave way to a new, more decentralized and even more brutal model. The powerful, monolithic cartels were replaced by hundreds of smaller, competing criminal bands, known as bandas criminales, or become, and powerful paramilitary groups, many of which were direct descendants of the vigilante forces that had hunted Escobar. The violence, while less concentrated, became more diffuse and in some ways more intractable, woven into the fabric of regional conflicts and local economies. The paramilitary groups, particularly the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, AUC, which was heavily influenced by the Castillo brothers of Los Peeps, became major actors in the nation's long-running internal conflict, fighting left-wing guerrillas and terrorizing civilian populations, all while engaging in massive drug trafficking themselves. This was one of Escobar's most enduring and tragic legacies. He had helped militarize and turbocharge the narcotics industry, creating a blueprint for violence and corruption that outlived him by decades. Beyond the shifting landscape of organized crime, Escobar's ghost continued to haunt the Colombian psyche. For the wealthy and the political class, his name became synonymous with a period of national shame and vulnerability, a time when the state was held hostage by a criminal. For the poor in Medellín, however, the myth of Robin Hood persisted, a testament to the profound failure of the state to provide for its most vulnerable citizens. This enduring, albeit controversial, affection was rooted in a tangible reality. The houses he built still stood in neighborhoods like Barrio Pablo Escobar. The soccer fields he funded were still in use. He had, in his twisted way, provided a form of brutal, pragmatic social welfare that the official government had been unable or unwilling to supply. This dichotomy ensured that his memory was never laid to rest. It became a subject of books, academic studies, and most powerfully, a wave of television series and films that catapulted his story to a global audience. The 2015 Netflix series, Narcos, introduced a dramatized version of his life to millions, reigniting global fascination and debate, and forcing a new generation to grapple with the complexities of his character. This commercialization of his infamy created a bizarre form of narco-tourism in Medellín, where tourists now visit his grave, the ruins of Hacienda Ena Poles, and the rooftop where he died. This phenomenon is deeply unsettling to many Colombians who see it as a glamorization of a dark and painful chapter in their history. Furthermore, his legacy lived on in a deeply personal way through his family. His wife and children, who changed their names and fled to Argentina, have lived a life in the shadow of his crimes, grappling with the dual burden of grief and public notoriety. His son, Juan Pablo, now known as Sebastian Marroquin, has spent years publicly repudiating his father's actions, seeking a form of redemption and arguing that his father's path is one of destruction, not glory. He has reached out to the families of his father's victims, a poignant and controversial effort to confront the immense suffering his father caused. This personal reckoning stands in stark contrast to the enduring allure of the Escobar brand, in popular culture. The story of Pablo Escobar, therefore, is not a closed book. It is a living, breathing, and deeply contentious part of modern history. His life and death forced Colombia to confront its deepest demons: corruption, inequality, and the fragility of its institutions. It demonstrated the catastrophic global consequences of drug prohibition and insatiable demand, and it left behind a nation forever marked by his passage, a country that had slain its most famous monster, only to discover that the monster had irrevocably changed the landscape, leaving behind a legacy as complex, contradictory, and enduring as the man himself. To truly comprehend the astronomical scale of Pablo Escobar's wealth and the operational might of his empire is to venture into a realm of numbers so vast they defy everyday understanding, painting a picture of a parallel economy that rivaled small nations. At the absolute zenith of his power in the late 1980s, Forbes magazine listed him as the seventh richest man in the world, with an estimated personal fortune of nearly $30 billion. His cartel was not a mere criminal organization. It was a multinational corporation with a product more lucrative than any legal commodity, boasting a profit margin that would make any Fortune 500 CEO dizzy. It was estimated that the Medellín Cartel was generating a staggering $420 million in revenue per week, which translates to $60 million every single day, or over $2.5 million every hour. This relentless tsunami of cash created logistical nightmares that became the stuff of legend. He reportedly had to write off 10% of his annual revenue as spoilage, money that was simply lost, stolen, or damaged beyond use, a figure that alone amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars. The physical storage of this wealth was an enterprise in itself. He employed teams of accountants and laborers whose sole job was to count, bundle, and hide the money. They used industrial, scale baling machines to compress the bills into manageable bricks. Vast sums were buried in secret locations all across Colombia, hidden in underground chambers on his properties, sealed in PVC pipes and sunk into the soft earth of remote farms, or stashed in the walls and false ceilings of safe houses. It is believed that billions of dollars remain hidden to this day, a buried treasure fueling myths and endless treasure hunts. But a fortune of this magnitude could not simply be hoarded. It had to be laundered and integrated into the legitimate economy, a process that further demonstrated the cartel's immense reach. Escobar invested heavily in real estate, purchasing thousands of properties across Colombia, from sprawling cattle ranches to entire apartment blocks in city centers. His most famous property, Hacienda Nanpols, was a 7.7 square mile testament to his obscene wealth and bizarre tastes. It featured a zoo with exotic animals like hippos, giraffes, and elephants, imported from around the world at immense cost. The estate had multiple swimming pools, a fleet of antique and luxury cars, a private airport, and even a series of concrete dinosaurs built near the entrance, a surreal display of power and whimsy. Beyond real estate, his web of legitimate businesses was vast and intricate, designed to clean his dirty money. He owned countless construction companies, which were perfect for laundering cash by inflating costs and reporting fake expenses. He purchased radio stations, car dealerships, and retail chains, all funneling narcodollars into the formal economy. The cartel's operational expenses were equally monumental, a dark mirror of a national budget. He maintained a private army of thousands, including sicarios, bodyguards, pilots, and lookouts, all of whom had to be paid, housed, and equipped. His payroll for corruption was arguably one of the largest line items, with millions of dollars distributed monthly to policemen, judges, politicians, and military officials at every level of Colombian society. This systemic bribery was the grease that kept his machine running smoothly, ensuring that warrants were lost, investigations were sabotaged, and tip-offs were delivered in time. The cost of his war against the state was incalculable, encompassing not just the price of weapons and explosives, but the economic damage inflicted on the nation through bombed infrastructure, lost tourism, and capital flight. When he offered to pay off Colombia's nor 10 billion foreign debt, it was not an empty boast. It was a transaction he could have feasibly completed, a stark demonstration that his financial power was, for a time, greater than that of the state he was fighting. This financial empire was the engine room of his power, the source of both his legendary philanthropy and his unparalleled brutality. The money allowed him to be both a savior and a devil, building homes for the poor while funding the murder of anyone who threatened his flow of capital. It enabled him to create a world where his law was the only law, a world where the price of a human life was negligible next to the value of a kilo of cocaine. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of his wealth is the most concrete evidence of his success and the most damning indictment of the system that allowed him to flourish. It was a fortune built on addiction and death, a mountain of cash stained with the blood of thousands, a testament to the fact that in the twisted economics of the drug trade, the most valuable currency is not money, but a complete and utter lack of morality. Beyond the cold, staggering statistics of his wealth and the brutal chronology of his crimes lies the more elusive, yet critically important, psychological portrait of the man himself, a complex and contradictory tapestry of deep, seated insecurities, megalomaniacal ambitions, and a warped moral compass that allowed him to be, in his own mind, both a savior and a destroyer. Pablo Escobar was not a simple, one-dimensional monster. He was a product of his environment, driven by a ferocious need to overcome the humiliations of his lower, middle-class upbringing and claim the respect and power he felt the world had denied him. This burning sense of social and economic resentment was the furnace that powered his entire life. He harbored a profound hatred for the Colombian elite, the oligarchs of Bogotá who looked down on him as a vulgar, uneducated criminal, a narco who could never truly buy his way into their exclusive circles. This rejection fueled his desire not just to be rich, but to be more powerful than them, to force them to acknowledge him, even if that acknowledgement came at the barrel of a gun. His foray into politics was a direct result of this craving for legitimacy. He wanted the official title, the recognition, the right to walk the halls of power as an equal. When that door was slammed in his face, by Justice Minister Lara Bonilla. The wound to his pride was so profound that it could only be answered with catastrophic violence. This interplay between a desperate need for love and a terrifying capacity for hatred defined his public persona. He cultivated the image of Robin Hood with meticulous care, understanding that the loyalty of the poor was a more effective shield than any army. He would personally hand out cash to beggars, fund community projects, and listen to the petitions of the destitute, creating a powerful myth that still endures in the slums of Medellín. He saw himself as a man of the people, a benefactor, and he derived genuine satisfaction from this role. Yet, this same man could order the murder of a presidential candidate, bomb a civilian airliner, and authorize the torture and dismemberment of his own associates without a flicker of remorse. This was not a case of split personality, but rather a unified, if twisted, worldview. He operated on a calculus where human life had a value, and that value was almost always lower than the strategic objective at hand. Those who were loyal to him, or who were useful to his public image, were protected and rewarded. Those who opposed him, or even those who were simply collateral damage in his war, were expendable assets. His relationship with his family provides another window into this complex psyche. By all accounts, he was a devoted and loving father and husband. He doted on his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, and was deeply attached to his wife, Maria Victoria. He went to great lengths to protect them, and his final, desperate phone calls from the rooftop were to his son, not to his lieutenants. This private humanity, however genuine, existed in a hermetically sealed compartment, entirely separate from his public life as a mass murderer. He was able to compartmentalize his existence so completely that he could play with his children in the morning and order a bombing that would orphan dozens of other children in the afternoon. This ability to dissociate was perhaps his most chilling characteristic. Underpinning everything was a monumental, almost delusional, sense of his own destiny. He believed he was a historical figure, a revolutionary, a man chosen for greatness. He was obsessed with his own legacy, meticulously collecting newspaper clippings about himself and dreaming of one day becoming the president of Colombia. This grandiosity made him fearless and ultimately reckless. He believed the normal rules of society and warfare did not apply to him, that he could outsmart, outbribe, and outfight any opponent indefinitely. It was this arrogance that led him to believe he could build his own prison and that he could win a direct war against the Colombian state and the United States government. The psychological portrait of Pablo Escobar is therefore not a simple one of insanity, but of a particular and dangerous form of sanity, a hyper-rational, amoral, and profoundly narcissistic mindset that calculated every action for maximum personal gain, whether that gain was measured in dollars, power, or adulation, and was willing to pay any price, so long as that price was paid by someone else. The technological and tactical dimensions of the hunt for Pablo Escobar represent a pivotal chapter in the history of law enforcement and modern warfare, marking a transition from traditional police work to a new era of intelligence-driven, technologically augmented pursuit. The Bloc de Escuida was not merely a larger police force. It was a prototype for the kind of specialized, multi-agency task forces that would later become standard in combating transnational terrorism and organized crime. Its creation signaled a recognition that a conventional approach was useless against an enemy who commanded the resources of a small nation and had deeply corrupted the state's own institutions. The transformation of the Bloc into a lethal and effective unit was heavily dependent on the direct and extensive involvement of the United States, which viewed the Medellín Cartel as a direct threat to its national security. This collaboration brought a suite of advanced technologies to Colombia that Escobar, for all his cunning, was ultimately unprepared to counter. The most critical of these was communications intelligence, or COMMT. The Americans provided the Bloc with state of the art direction, finding equipment, which allowed them to triangulate the source of radio transmissions. Escobar's reliance on his Motorola handheld radios was his operational lifeline, but it became an electronic leash that the Bloc slowly and patiently followed. They set up a network of listening posts on high ground throughout Medellín, creating a web that could pinpoint the general neighborhood of a transmission. This was complemented by the deployment of surveillance aircraft, including sophisticated planes equipped with signals intelligence, GMT packages, which could fly over the city and further refine the location of a signal from the air. This created a multi-layered tracking system that was relentless and impersonal. Alongside this electronic net was the crucial and highly controversial human intelligence provided by his turned associates. The psychological warfare waged by Los Pips had made betrayal not just a possibility, but a probability. Figures like his cousin, Luis Fernando, El Negro, Galeano, and others within his inner circle, worn down by the constant fear and the systematic destruction of their own lives and assets, began to cooperate with the authorities. They provided the essential context that the electronic signals lacked. The specific safe houses being used, the codes and frequencies, the daily routines, and the identities of the remaining key players. This fusion of high-tech surveillance and deep human intelligence created an unprecedentedly accurate picture of Escobar's shrinking world. The Bloc also leveraged other advanced tools for the time. They used computer databases to cross-reference and analyze vast amounts of information: vehicle registrations, property records, phone logs, looking for patterns and connections that would have been impossible to find manually. They employed psychological profilers to understand his mindset and predict his behavior, anticipating that his pride and his attachment to his family would be his undoing. The interception of his emotional, desperate calls to his son at the Hotel Tequendama was a direct result of this psychological targeting. The final raid itself was a testament to this new model of policing. The team that descended on Los Olivos was not a large, unwieldy force that would have alerted the entire neighborhood. It was a small, agile, and highly trained unit of commandos acting on real-time, verified intelligence. They moved with the confidence of knowing exactly who they were hunting and where he was, a luxury denied to all previous attempts to capture him. The success of the bloc de Busqueda, therefore, was not a triumph of brute force, but a victory of integrated intelligence. It proved that a non-state actor, no matter how wealthy and powerful, could be systematically dismantled by a state that was willing to marshal its full technological, military, and intelligence resources and to operate in the morally ambiguous gray areas where such wars are inevitably fought. The hunt for Escobar became a grim textbook for future conflicts, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of combining signals intelligence with human sources, and the absolute necessity of protecting those sources through swift and decisive action. It was a formula that would be studied and refined in the decades to come, but in the streets of Medellín in 1993. It was the key that finally unlocked the cage of the world's most wanted man. The story of Pablo Escobar is inextricably linked to the city of Medellín, a relationship so profound and toxic that it transformed the very identity and physical landscape of the city, a trauma from which it would take decades to recover and rebuild. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Medellín was not just the headquarters of the Medellín Cartel, it was the epicenter of a narco state, a city where the authority of the government was a faint echo, and the word of Pablo Escobar was the true law. The cartel's influence seeped into every facet of daily life, creating a society operating under a permanent state of duress and paradoxical normalcy. For the average citizen, life was a tightrope walk between the mundane and the murderous. The sound of gunfire became a common background noise, a sudden burst of popcorn, like pops that could signal anything from a personal settling of scores to a strategic assassination ordered by ill patron. The sight of young sicarios on motorcycles, their faces grim and determined, weaving through traffic with a chilling purpose, became an ordinary, if terrifying, part of the urban scenery. Parents lived in constant fear for their children, worried they would be caught in the crossfire of a drive, by shooting, or worse, be recruited by the cartel's allure of easy money and power. The city's economy was schizophrenic. On one hand, the flood of narco dollars created a bizarre, hyper-inflated boom. Construction thrived as cartel members built their extravagant, gaudy mansions, which locals called narco aesthetic, characterized by Greek columns, mirrored walls, and gold-plated fixtures. Luxury car dealerships, nightclubs, and high-end restaurants flourished, catering to the newly rich traffickers and their entourages. Yet, this artificial prosperity was built on a foundation of fear and violence. Business owners, from small shopkeepers to wealthy industrialists, were subjected to the vacuna, or vaccine, a euphemism for the extortion payments demanded by the cartel. To refuse was a death sentence. The social fabric was torn between gratitude and terror. In the comunas, the steep, sprawling slums that cling to the mountainsides, Escobar was a folk hero. He was the only one who had ever paid them any attention, the man who provided tangible improvements to their lives when the state was absent. He built sports complexes, funded schools, and handed out cash. creating a powerful base of loyalists who would warn him of police movements and shelter him when he was on the run. This created an impenetrable human shield, a wall of silence and complicity that the authorities found almost impossible to breach. The city's institutions were hollowed out from within. The police force was deeply compromised, with officers either on the cartel's payroll or too terrified to act. Judges who tried to prosecute cartel members were assassinated, their murders sending a clear message to their colleagues. The newspaper El Colombiano operated under constant threat, its editors and journalists knowing that a story that displeased Escobar could lead to a bomb at their doorstep or a bullet for their family. This pervasive atmosphere of fear reached its peak during the all-out war following his escape from La Catedral. The city became a battlefield. Car bombs detonated with terrifying randomness, shattering windows and lives. Police stations were fortified like military bunkers. The funerals of policemen became daily, somber affairs. The city was paralyzed, a hostage to the wrath of one man. The psychological toll on the people of Medellín was immense, a collective trauma of grief, anxiety, and a forced desensitization to violence that would mark generations. After Escobar's death, the city did not simply return to normal. It was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered society, to confront the deep social divides he had both exploited and highlighted, and to slowly, painstakingly, rebuild its institutions and its reputation. The transformation of Medellín in the years that followed, with its innovative public transportation, library parks, and social urbanism projects, was a direct and conscious response to the conditions that had allowed Escobar to flourish. It was an attempt to reclaim the city from his ghost, to prove that the state could, in fact, provide dignity and opportunity, and that the legacy of the city would no longer be defined by its most infamous son, but by its remarkable resilience and its hard-won redemption. The international dimensions of the Pablo Escobar saga reveal a global ecosystem of crime, corruption, and consumption that stretched far beyond the borders of Colombia, implicating governments, financial institutions, and societies across the Americas and Europe. The Medellín Cartel was a pioneer in globalization, albeit of the most sinister kind, creating a supply chain that connected the remote coca fields of the Andes to the nightclubs of Miami and the streets of New York, with tentacles reaching into the political and economic heart of numerous nations. The primary market, the insatiable engine of the entire enterprise, was the United States. The demand for cocaine in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in the form of crack cocaine, which ravaged inner cities, created an economic pull factor of immense power. Escobar's genius was in his ability to meet this demand with industrial efficiency. But the journey of the cocaine northward required the systematic corruption of multiple countries. The transit routes through the Caribbean turned nations like the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Cuba into key logistical hubs where airstrips were rented, officials were bribed, and local gangs were enlisted as partners. In Mexico, while the cartels, they were not yet the dominant force they would become. They acted as crucial transportation allies for the Colombians, a partnership that would later evolve as the Mexican cartels grew in power and eventually seized control of the entire trafficking route. The reach of the cartel extended to Europe as well, establishing distribution networks in Spain and Italy, often leveraging connections with existing organized crime groups like the Italian Mafia. This international footprint was matched by an equally globalized financial operation. The billions of dollars in profit generated in the United States could not simply be repatriated to Colombia in suitcases. It had to be laundered through the world's financial system. This gave rise to a sophisticated money laundering apparatus that involved Panamanian banks, where loose financial regulations provided a convenient haven, as well as complex schemes using front companies in the United States and Europe. The cartel would purchase everything from luxury goods to real estate with drug dollars in the U.S., then sell these assets, creating a trail of seemingly legitimate income that could be transferred to Colombia. They also used the ancient, informal banking system of Hawala, or the black market peso exchange, which allowed them to circumvent the traditional banking system entirely. In this system, drug dollars collected in the U.S. would be sold at a discount to Colombian importers, who would then use them to purchase American goods for export to Colombia, effectively cleaning the money and integrating it into the legal economy. The response from the international community, particularly the United States, was initially fragmented and often ineffective. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was on the front lines, but its agents in Colombia operated in a hostile environment, constantly under threat and hampered by the pervasive corruption that protected Escobar. The turning point in international involvement came with the declaration of the war on drugs by President Richard Nixon and its intensification under President Ronald Reagan. This policy framework framed drug trafficking as a national security threat, leading to increased military and financial aid to Colombia and other Andean nations. The U.S. provided training, helicopters, surveillance technology, and intelligence to the Colombian police and military. However, this intervention was also fraught with complications and moral dilemmas. The U.S. focus was often narrowly on interdiction and capturing kingpins, with less attention paid to the root causes of the trade, such as poverty in Colombia or rampant demand at home. Furthermore, the U.S. alliance with sometimes brutal elements within the Colombian military and the indirect, unofficial collaboration with the vigilante Los Pips group raised serious questions about human rights and the methods used to achieve victory. The Escobar manhunt became a prototype for a new kind of international cooperation against non-state threats. But it also exposed the dark compromises and unintended consequences that such cooperation could entail. The global war against Escobar was not just a law enforcement operation. It was a geopolitical struggle that reshaped international drug policy, intelligence sharing, and the very nature of cross-border crime fighting for decades to come, demonstrating that in an interconnected world, the problem of organized crime could not be contained within national borders. and neither could the violence it spawned. The human cost of Pablo Escobar's reign, a number so vast it becomes a blur of statistics, demands a moment of reflection to grasp the true, horrifying scale of the suffering he inflicted, a tapestry of individual tragedies woven into the national psyche of Colombia. The official estimates of deaths, directly and indirectly attributable to his cartel's activities, range from 4,000 to 10,000 people. But this number is a cold, incomplete abstraction that fails to capture the shattered families, the orphaned children, the cowed society, and the generations traumatized by relentless violence. The victims were not faceless casualties. They were judges like Rodrigo Lara Bonilla and Tulio Manuel Castro Gil, murdered for upholding the law. They were policemen, thousands of them, gunned down in the streets or targeted for assassination simply for wearing a uniform, leaving behind widows and fatherless children. They were journalists like Guillermo Cano of El Espectador, blown up for daring to print the truth. They were politicians like Luis Carlos Galán, a man of immense promise, cut down for his principles. They were the 107 innocent passengers and crew aboard Avianca Flight 2 and 3, blown out of the sky as pawns in a brutal game. They were the shoppers, the clerks, the passers-by killed by the shrapnel of car bombs detonated outside department stores and government buildings. Their lives erased to send a political message. Beyond these high-profile targets were the countless anonymous victims, the rivals and their families slaughtered in turf wars, the business owners executed for refusing to pay extortion, the men, women, and children caught in the crossfire of Sicario Drive by shootings, the farmers and laborers in the coca fields living in a state of indentured servitude, and the millions of addicts in consuming countries whose lives were destroyed by the product he so efficiently pumped into their communities. The violence was not just about killing, it was about mutilation and terror as a political tool, the practice of necklacing, where a tire filled with gasoline was placed around a victim's neck and set alight, or the dismemberment of bodies with chainsaws, were tactics employed to instill a paralyzing fear that would silence all opposition. This created a culture of silence, of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, that allowed the cartel to operate with impunity. The psychological impact on Colombian society was profound and lasting. An entire generation grew up with the sound of gunfire as a lullaby and the sight of corpses on the evening news as a daily routine. The constant state of anxiety, the fear of speaking freely on the phone, the hesitation to criticize the powerful, became ingrained in the national character. The trauma manifested in a deep-seated collective pessimism and a cynical distrust of public institutions, which were seen as either impotent or complicit. For the families of the victims, the pain was not a historical event, but a lifelong sentence of grief and unanswered questions. Many were denied even the basic comfort of justice, as witnesses were too terrified to testify and evidence was lost to corruption. The legacy of this victimhood is a wound that has yet to fully heal in Colombia. Organizations like the group Personas por la Vida, formed by families of those killed on Avianca Flight 2 and 3, continue to fight for recognition and reparations, their quiet dignity standing in stark contrast to the noisy glamorization of Escobar in popular culture. The story of Pablo Escobar is, at its core, the story of these victims. To focus solely on his wealth, his power, or his cunning is to do a profound disservice to their memory. His reign was not a glamorous adventure. It was a period of national mourning, a descent into a Hobbesian state of nature, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short for countless innocent people. The true measure of his legacy is not found in the ruins of hacienda and poles or the hidden stashes of cash, but in the silent grief of a mother who lost her son, a wife who lost her husband, a child who lost a parent, all casualties of a war they never asked for, a war waged by a man who believed his ambition was worth more than their lives. The philosophical and moral questions raised by the life and crimes of Pablo Escobar force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the allure of power, and the societal conditions that allow a figure of such destructive capacity to emerge and flourish. He stands as a stark case study in the banality of evil, not in the bureaucratic sense described by Hannah Arendt, but in the way his monumental wickedness was driven by utterly mundane and recognizable human desires for money, for respect, for power, for legacy. He was not a mythical demon. He was a man who made a series of conscious, calculated choices to pursue his ambitions by any means necessary, and in doing so, he held up a dark mirror to the societies that consumed his product and condemned his methods. His story challenges the simplistic binary of good versus evil, revealing instead a world of murky grays where a mass murderer could also be a beloved benefactor, where the forces of order collaborated with vigilantes, and where the demand from the world's most powerful nations fueled the very violence they sought to eradicate. The central, haunting question was Pablo Escobar a singular monster, an anomalous eruption of pure evil, or was he a logical, if extreme, product of a specific set of circumstances? The evidence strongly suggests the latter. He was born into a country with a deeply entrenched class system, where social mobility for a man of his background was severely limited. The Colombian state in his formative years was often absent, weak, or corrupt in the very communities where he built his base of support. When he provided housing, infrastructure, and a sense of agency to the poor, he was filling a vacuum left by the state, and the enduring affection for him in some quarters is a permanent indictment of that failure. Furthermore, the immense demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe created an economic opportunity of staggering proportions. The war on drugs, with its focus on supply, side interdiction, and militarized enforcement, failed to address this root cause, instead creating a risk premium that made the trade even more profitable for those, like Escobar, who were willing to embrace extreme violence. In this sense, Escobar was as much a symptom as a cause, a symptom of global inequality, systemic corruption, and failed drug policies. His life forces us to examine the seductive power of the outlaw archetype, the romantic figure who exists outside the law and challenges the established order. He actively cultivated this image, positioning himself as a rebel against a corrupt oligarchy, a narrative that still resonates with those who feel disenfranchised by their own governments. This reveals a dangerous human tendency to admire power even when it is destructive, and to root for the ambitious underdog even when his methods are abhorrent. The global fascination with his story, the Narcos phenomenon, and the narco tourism in Medellín are all testaments to this dark allure. We are drawn to the spectacle of his audacity, his cunning, and his wealth, often glossing over the thousands of graves he filled. This fascination raises ethical questions about how we consume and memorialize violence. Are we learning from history, or are we, in a way, perpetuating the very glamour he sought to project? Ultimately, the philosophical lesson of Pablo Escobar is a warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the fragility of civilization. He demonstrated that when institutions are weak, when the rule of law is negotiable, and when the economic incentives for crime vastly outweigh those for legality, a single individual with sufficient ruthlessness and intelligence can bring a nation to its knees. His story is a testament to the fact that evil is not always a foreign, incomprehensible force. It can be a rational, even entrepreneurial enterprise. It is a chilling reminder that the line between a respected businessman and a ruthless warlord is often thinner than we care to admit, and that the same ambition that builds empires can also unleash hell, leaving behind a legacy of ruin that serves as a permanent monument to the darkest potentials of the human spirit. The final, enduring legacy of Pablo Escobar, the one that continues to evolve and provoke debate decades after his death, is a complex and deeply fractured inheritance, a ghost that haunts not only Colombia, but the entire global conversation about crime, justice, and the nature of power itself. His story did not conclude with a neat moral. It splintered into 1,000 competing narratives, each reflecting a different facet of the colossal damage he inflicted and the unsettling questions he raised. For the nation of Colombia, his death brought a palpable, collective sigh of relief, an end to the immediate, existential threat he posed to the state. It allowed the country to begin the long, painful process of rebuilding its institutions, reclaiming its sovereignty, and confronting the deep-seated social and political cancers that his empire had both exploited and exacerbated. The remarkable transformation of Medellín from the world's murder capital to a model of urban innovation is the most powerful rebuttal to his legacy, a testament to the resilience of its people and a conscious effort to address the very inequalities he had manipulated. Yet, the victory was far from complete. The cocaine trade did not disappear, it metastasized, fragmenting into the more decentralized and in some ways more resilient B-crimes, while the powerful paramilitary groups that helped hunt him down became major narco-traffickers in their own right, plunging the country into a new, complex phase of its internal conflict. The success of the Escobar manhunt also left a troubling blueprint of state, collaboration with vigilante forces, a morally compromised strategy that created its own cycle of violence and impunity. For his family, The legacy has been a life sentence of a different kind, a perpetual existence in the shadow of his infamy. His son, Sebastian Marroquin, has embarked on a lifelong, public journey of atonement, writing letters to the sons of his father's victims, seeking a dialogue that acknowledges the immense suffering and rejecting the path of his father. This poignant, personal struggle represents a human effort to wrest something redeemable from the overwhelming darkness, a conscious choice to define a legacy of contrition rather than one of continued glorification. In popular culture, however, the Escobar brand has been commodified and often dangerously romanticized. The global success of series like Narcos has created a paradoxical icon, a figure of fascination whose brutal actions are sometimes overshadowed by a narrative that focuses on his cunning, his wealth, and his rebellious charm. This has fueled a booming narco tourism industry in Medellín, where visitors pose for pictures on the roof where he died or visit his grave, an activity that many Colombians find deeply offensive, as it trivializes a period of national trauma and turns human suffering into a macabre attraction. This tension between historical reckoning and commercial exploitation highlights the ongoing struggle over his memory. Is he a subject for serious historical study, a case study in criminal entrepreneurship and state failure? Or is he an anti-hero for a disillusioned age, a symbol of ruthless ambition in a world perceived as corrupt and unjust? The answer depends entirely on one's perspective, and that is the essence of his enduring, troubling presence. Furthermore, his life continues to serve as a critical reference point in the global debate on drug policy. He is the ultimate argument for the proponents of the war on drugs, a living and dying example of the violence and chaos that the illicit drug trade can unleash. Yet, for those who argue for decriminalization or legalization, he is equally powerful evidence of the catastrophic failure of prohibitionist policies, demonstrating that as long as there is massive demand, a lucrative black market will exist, and it will be controlled by violent criminals. Escobar proved that the profit margins in an illegal market are so astronomically high that they can fund a private war against nations. His legacy, therefore, is not a static relic of the past, but a living, breathing argument that continues to shape policy and perception. He remains a dark star in the firmament of modern history, a gravitational force that pulls us toward uncomfortable conversations about inequality, corruption, justice, and the very nature of evil. The story of Pablo Escobar is ultimately unfinished. It is a story that is still being written by the politicians, the artists, the victims' families, the tourists, and the historians, all of whom are trying to make sense of the colossal, bloody, and unforgettable mark he left on the world. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, a long and harrowing descent into the life and times of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, a man whose name has become synonymous with both limitless ambition and bottomless cruelty. From the dusty streets of Rio Negro to the opulent squalor of his private prison, and finally to the sun-baked rooftop where his life was violently extinguished, his story unfolds as a classical tragedy writ on a global scale, a chilling reminder of the destructive potential that lies dormant within the human spirit when it is untethered from any moral compass. We have traced the arc of his meteoric rise, witnessing how a young man seething with resentment and ambition identified a fleeting opportunity in the global drug trade and exploited it with a genius for logistics and a ruthlessness that shocked the world. We saw him build a corporate empire that functioned with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, yet whose business was the enslavement of addiction, and whose corporate governance was the law of the gun. We observed his calculated foray into politics, his brief, surreal tenure as a congressman, and the catastrophic war he unleashed when the gates of legitimacy were slammed shut in his face. We felt the tremors of his narcoterrorism, the car bombs and the assassinations that held an entire nation hostage, forcing Colombia to stare into the abyss of its own fragility. We followed him into the gilded cage of La Catedral, a monument to his arrogance and the state's desperation, and we witnessed his final, frantic flight from that cage, a desperate scramble for survival through the city he once ruled as a king. We stood beside the hunters who finally cornered him, a task force empowered by American technology and fueled by intimate betrayal, and we saw the ignominious end of the so called King of Cocaine, his body bleeding out on a terracotta tile roof, a world away from the palaces of his dreams. But this story is more than a chronology of crimes. It is a deep and enduring inquiry into the nature of power, corruption, and societal failure. Escobar was not an alien invader. He was a product of his environment, a malignant growth fed by the nutrients of profound social inequality, institutional weakness, and colossal global demand for his product. He was the ultimate paradox. A man who built homes and funded communities, yet could order the murder of children on an airplane. A devoted family man who presided over the destruction of thousands of other families. A man who craved the respect of the establishment while waging a war of extermination against it. His life forces us to question the very frameworks through which we understand good and evil, challenging us to see the banality and the rationality that can underpin even the most monstrous of enterprises. The world after Escobar is a world he helped shape. The drug trade he industrialized continues to flourish, having mutated into new, more diffuse, and equally violent forms. The tactics used to hunt him, the fusion of high-tech surveillance, international cooperation, and collaboration with unsavory allies, have become standard procedure in the fight against transnational terrorism and organized crime. The city of Medellín, his former fiefdom, has become a global symbol of urban redemption, a powerful, living rebuttal to his legacy, proving that communities can heal and institutions can be rebuilt. Yet, his ghost lingers. It lingers in the continued debate over drug policy, where his specter is invoked by all sides. It lingers in the quiet grief of the victims' families, for whom justice remains an elusive concept. It lingers in the bizarre cult of personality that surrounds him in popular culture, a dangerous glamorization of violence and impunity. And it lingers in the persistent social and economic divides that he so skillfully exploited, a reminder that the conditions which create an Escobar have not entirely vanished. The story of Pablo Escobar is, therefore, a permanent cautionary tale. It warns us of the perils of unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of absolute power. It illustrates the devastating consequences when the social contract is broken and the state fails in its most basic duties to its citizens. And it stands as a grim testament to the fact that the line between a revolutionary and a terrorist, a businessman and a gangster, a hero and a monster, is often perilously thin, determined not by the grandness of one's vision, but by the morality of one's methods. His life was a fire that burned with a brilliant, terrifying intensity, consuming everything in its path. And when it was finally extinguished, it left behind a landscape of ash and memory, a chilling lesson for the ages on the price of a dream pursued without a soul. The saga of Pablo Escobar is a profound and unsettling chapter in modern history, a story that forces us to confront the darkest corners of power and human nature. If this deep dive into the rise and fall of the world's most infamous drug lord has captivated you, if you find yourself fascinated by the intricate stories of history's most powerful and controversial figures, then your journey into the past does not have to end here. Our channel is dedicated to unearthing the truths behind the legends, separating fact from fiction, and bringing you comprehensive narratives that are both engaging and enlightening. We invest countless hours in research to ensure that every story we tell is presented with accuracy and depth. To continue this journey with us, and to ensure you never miss another exploration into the events and people that have shaped our world, please show your support. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon to receive notifications for all our new uploads, and like this video. Your engagement fuels our passion for storytelling and allows us to bring more such incredible histories to light. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to guiding you through the next chapter of history.